ladies and gentlemen. I think I know most of you. My name's Anne-Marie Murphy. I'm a senior research scholar here at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia, and it is my distinct pleasure to invite you to this talk on Beyond the Grass and the Elephant, Strategic Thinking in Southeast Asia with Don Emerson. Most of you know Don. I think you will agree with me that he is probably the country's foremost expert on Southeast Asian things strategic, at least among those who are writing for the academic audience. Oh, come on,
I paid her a lot.
No, you did
paid
not.
her. I
You
wrote
did
a
not.
large check. You wouldn't believe how much I paid. That's the least I can get.
Don is currently the director of the Southeast Asia program in the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University, where he's also a faculty affiliate at the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies and the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. He is very prolific. His latest book, The Deer and the Dragon, Southeast Asia Between China and the U.S., is coming out in November, correct? All right.
Well, inshallah.
Okay. So since I know some of you have to leave at 5 o'clock, I will not go through his extremely long CV with you, other to say that he was previously at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we are delighted to have Don with us today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. I really appreciate this. Okay, I'm going to try to shut up on time. It's going to be a little difficult, but look, I'm not an expert on strategy, so if you want to walk out, now's a good time. I'm not. I have insatiable intellectual curiosity. It's a crippling disease. It really is. And so I decided to speak on something that I really know very little about. Okay, so, you know, I'm in front of you. I don't pretend to be an expert. I'm not an expert. But maybe in the process of learning a little bit more about what strategy might actually be and then trying to apply some of those notions to a Southeast Asian context where I am a little bit less ignorant, maybe the result is worth at least a few minutes of your time. Let me begin by saying, as a novice to the literature on strategy, I was perhaps being naive in thinking that there might be at least some form of general consensus about what a strategy actually is. My naivete became quickly evident. Now, this is bad news, I suppose, for a literalist or a strict empiricist who think that the names of things should have clear connections and limited scope. But I'm a little bit more, forgive me for the term, it's very obsolete, postmodernist in this regard, so I actually enjoy the variety of meanings that one can trigger through the use of a term like strategy. And I'll run through, I'm not going to go into the detail, we'd run out of time, but I can't resist running through a little bit of the smorgasbord that is involved here. First of all, there is a literature that says very simply that strategy is linkage. It's linkage between means and ends. Then there are those, I think a little more creatively perhaps, who say, no, it's an observed pattern. It's a pattern. It does not have to be causal. It's quite striking. It's an observed pattern, which means that the pattern may actually not be consciously held in the mind of the strategist. The strategist may not know that they're engaged in strategy, but if there is a pattern that can be teased out of the thinking and perhaps also the behavior, then it turns out that it is strategic. There are those who emphasize the future and who say strategy involves necessarily future-facing projection. It's a projection. It reflects a necessary prediction, a calculation as to how variables are going to twist and turn, again, in some sort of pattern, to achieve the result of the linkage between the means and the end. You see, here we go. Then there are those who say, no, it's a problem-solving solution. If there's no problem, there's no strategy, and the point is to solve the problem, okay? Then there's those who say, no, it is a premeditated design. And I won't go into that particular variation, but they emphasize the need for consciousness. So those that believe in design are at war with those who believe in the observed pattern, because those who believe in design think that it has to be intentional on the part of the actor conscious. And then last but not least, there are those who say, no, it's a doctrine. You can identify a strategic doctrine and forget all these other questions about causality or whatever, So here, I guess, what would one say? Marx had a prediction Lenin had a doctrine. A doctrine of action. I mean, I don't know, I'm making that up, so maybe that's inappropriate. But and then I want to say that strategic often is a synonym for important. A strategic decision really matters a lot. I had not realized before I began trying to reduce my ignorance on this topic so that I would not be too embarrassed today, did not realize that there is such a thing as a strategic thinking institute. There is an institute for strategic thinking. I guess I could go there. I looked for their physical location and was disappointed that they did not give me a physical location. But you can collect through the internet. And that would suggest that if it's strategic, it's got to be about survival. Because I learned that the motto of the Strategic Thinking Institute is be strategic or be gone. In other words, it's life and death.
Maybe they're gone.
That's right. Exactly, right, exactly. So anyway, as you can see, I'm running out of time. So I am going to, and I have a whole section here that I'm going to skip, which tries to piece these various things together. I'm not going to bore you with that. I am going to, however, suggest 3 goals. That my argument here is that whatever else you think about strategy, it has to be purposive, okay? That opens up a lot. But it says no goal, no strategy, okay? And I'm trying to think of broad goals that would be applicable in Southeast Asia, and actually more broadly perhaps in East Asia, because I would argue, given my own narrow empirical base here, where I'm a little bit more comfortable, is that my understanding of strategy in Southeast Asia is very oriented toward the reactions that Southeast Asian governments have to China. And also because that's the topic of this book that finally, hopefully someday, will come out. And here I have 3 abstract, rather broad goals in mind. First of all, and I have to choose this word very carefully, primacy. And I'm associating this primarily with China, in the presence of experts on China who, I'm intimidated, frankly, but, I'm not going to shut up. So primacy, because there are other choices one could make, right? What does primacy mean, right? I mean, from the Trump administration, it seems to me that what they're worried about is some sort of dominance. I mean, there are even some perhaps who might even argue that China wants to dominate the entire world, which strikes me as a absurd proposition, because remember that a strategy has to link means and ends to some sense, right? And does China have the means to dominate the world? Not in my view. Although, again, I could be corrected. So primacy. Now, in Southeast Asia, are there countries that want to be, have that title of... Indonesia, obviously, is the least implausible candidate based on size, because it's by far the largest country in Southeast Asia. And one could go back to the days of Sukarno and make some kind of an argument, which I won't do. But today, I'm going to argue later that really there's not much evidence that Indonesia wants some kind of primacy. In fact, some of the other members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations rather regret, if I may say so, that the term primacy is not more frequently used by people in the Foreign Ministry, the Department of Defense, and so forth, because the sort of classical position, stereotype, I guess, of Indonesia was, as the largest country in Southeast Asia, it should be the leader of ASEAN, right? And there's not a lot of evidence that Jokowi, the current president, wants to bother leading ASEAN. Okay, so primacy, right? Second, autonomy. Now, this is more common in Southeast Asia, right? When you're a big country, the largest population on Earth, and your economy, okay, it may not be in the OECD category quite yet, but you have a powerful military, your name is China. Do you really worry about autonomy? It may tend to follow naturally from your size and power. Now, I'm not suggesting that the folks in Beijing are insensitive to the possibility that they may be asked to share, at least with the U.S., or engage in other activities that might demonstrate a willingness to abandon some autonomy. And at the moment, they happen to be championing the kinds of multilateral arrangements, at least rhetorically, that would imply that the participants in those arrangements would be willing to give up some of their autonomy in return for other benefits. But autonomy is critical in Southeast Asia. Dewi Fortuna Anwar, whom some of you may know, who's a leading sort of, I don't know if I want to say strategic intellectual, but she does think about strategy, certainly, in Jakarta, argues that strategic autonomy, this gets complicated, that the goal of the strategy is strategic autonomy. There's a little bit of redundancy there and duplication, which I'm not quite sure what to do with. But her argument is that the Southeast Asian countries must, above all, be autonomous, because from that will follow all kinds of things, right? The best policies and so forth. It doesn't necessarily follow, in my view, but that is certainly her view. And I can't resist inserting, just for a couple of seconds here, sometimes strategy in Southeast Asia is thought of in metaphorical terms, in analogical terms, or even in anecdotal terms. The title of the book that Anne-Marie just mentioned, The Deer and the Dragon, suggests that we have does and bucks, which are really more associated with when I was at the Wisconsin, yes, we had deer in Wisconsin, but how many deer are there in Southeast Asia? Last time I checked. But of course, what I have in mind is the mouse deer, the kancil, which is an altogether different animal. And appropriately, for the purpose of my lecture, it was indeed Dewi who, having written this piece on strategy in Southeast Asia, which was somewhat cautious about the ability of Southeast Asian countries really to develop strategic autonomy, ended up by reverting to the mouse deer, by saying kancil, which is the name in an Indonesian context. The mouse deer is small and weak by comparison to, in this case, the dragon. But the mouse deer is clever, extremely clever, and so there are myths and stories and tales that date back. And this is not just Indonesia. It's Malaysia. There are counterparts even in the mainland countries of Southeast Asia, although they don't use this particular phrase. And somehow the mouse deer wins, like a kind of a jujitsu, right, against the enemy. Now, if you actually look at those stories, you will find them inadequate guides, I believe, to action. Because one reason the mouse deer wins is that the dragon is incredibly stupid and easily manipulated. And so, frankly, there's a lot of wishful thinking in this particular metaphor. But the fact that the metaphor circulates shows you how important the issue of asymmetry is. You know, it's an equivalent, I suppose, to David and Goliath, right? You have this giant, and you are obliged to live next to the giant. You have no choice in the matter. Vietnam might like to be in South America. They can't. Right? And so how do you deal with that inequality? Well, one way to do it is through wishful thinking, and you think of yourself as the mouse deer, and you try to be, clever and so forth. And I'll get into that in a minute. And that kind of a strategy, based on cleverness, right, recognizes the inequality and tries to overcome it, okay? And then the third is prosperity. Now here it seems to me no country in Southeast Asia is against the goal of prosperity, neither is China. That's a no-brainer. How you get there is another matter. Okay. I'll skip this, and, except for two other, briefly, especially since, all right. There's scope and time. What's the difference between strategy and grand strategy? Clearly, that's a matter of scope. The BRI, arguably, now, I really feel a little bit intimidated here, but you savage me during the Q&A. Really, I invite that. My view would be that the BRI may not be grand strategy, but it certainly is vast in scope. It's vast in scope in two respects. It's vast geographically, because, I'm not going to talk about the BRI. That's going to happen at 6 o'clock. The speaker is excellent. His book is terrific. I recommend it. Well, I think except we're having dinner, but okay, so enough of that. Now, time is the other variable. No, what I was going to say with regard to the BRI is that not only is it global in scope, but there are two different dimensions. One is an economic dimension, the other is a political security dimension, and I would argue that both are present. And so the real critical issue is, what is the proportion between the two? Does the economic dominate, or is it the other way around? And of course that would vary from country to country, right? But scope is important to keep in mind. And last time, Michael Pillsbury, I won't comment on Michael Pillsbury, except to say that he believes that China is running a kind of hyper-strategic 100-year marathon. That's the title of his book, 100-year marathon. And of course, the other argument, if I can, quote Deng Xiaoping, is feeling your way on the stones to get across the river, right? Which is a much more zigzag kind of incremental process. If the stone is over here, well, then you're necessarily going to have to go there. There's still a goal. You got to cross the river. But there's no grand strategy, certainly. And no, it's chess, right? Synoptic strategy. This is a kind of an experimental strategy. And you could argue that the economic growth that China has enjoyed since the days when Deng Xiaoping made his famous southern tour are partly because of their willingness to accept an experiment and to upscale the experiment rather than to have some kind of deductive plan in advance. This is what we're going to do. So I kind of loosen the idea of strategy. Okay, now I want to move to the elephants and grass. Of course, this is not the mouse deer. This is a very, very different metaphor. And I want to quote Kishore Mahbubani, about whom much could be said, and I have no time to say it, so I won't say it. I want to quote him from a debate at the University of Toronto that I recommend to you. It's available on YouTube. Here's the quote. "One day, they're fighting, and the next day, they're smiling and shaking hands and making a deal. We don't know what's going on." He's Singaporean. "We don't know what's going on. So my advice from Singapore is to remember the wisdom of the old Sri Lankan proverb. When the elephants fight, the grass suffers. When the elephants make love, the grass also suffers." What's wrong with the grass and the metaphor? Why do I title this talk Beyond the Grass and the Elephants? Because I think that the grass and elephants metaphor is not only a reactionary throwback to the days, relatively bipolar days of the Cold War, it is absurd. First, the grass is unrealistically deprived of any agency whatsoever. The grass cannot move unless, if they're lucky, maybe there's a little breeze that comes through and they tremble a little bit. Number one. Number two, the grass is allocated zero responsibility for its suffering, as if it were completely innocent of being trampled. No, I'm sorry. I mean, I work on Southeast Asia. I love the place, but I can be critical as an academic of some of the things they do, which frankly don't necessarily serve their own interests as well as one might think. Third, the analogy ignores how the grass, far from doomed to be flattened, can benefit not only from peace and predictability that Sino-US cooperation could bring, making love, but also benefit from animosity between China and the United States. When I say this in Southeast Asia, it's hard to drag people out of the frame of the grass and the elephants, although I try. Think of the collateral benefit that some Southeast Asian economies are reaping from the current trade war between the United States and China, as firms transfer investments and operations from China to Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam, I might note. And here's an example of strategy that just occurs to me. What has happened recently in Thailand, right? Prayut has decided, and I'm not sure if it's Prayut in person, but his cabinet at least has agreed that what they're going to try to do is make Thailand more attractive to firms in China so that they will come to Thailand rather than going to Vietnam. Now, this is a strategy, right, with a clear objective. The objective, ultimately, I suppose you could say, is prosperity, right, on the part of the Thais. There's evidence of strategies, including many strategies, daily, all around. Okay, one could even imagine, this is perhaps going off on a limb, but that's what I like to do. One could even imagine a ruthlessly Machiavellian Southeast Asian leader hatching a strategy based on the concept of optimal animosity between China and the United States, in which the tension is enough for each antagonist to motivate Southeast Asian support against its rival, but not enough to trigger a damaging war, right? If to invent a phrase here, let's call this the la-la option. Limited animosity, limited affinity, right? Not to the point of making love, maybe necking instead, okay? Or what we used to call necking. Way back when. Okay. I was going to develop that further, but I don't really have time to do that. Is there an overarching strategy that is not being undertaken? This is presumptuous, very presumptuous for me as an outsider, that is not being undertaken in Southeast Asia that would be a logical, obvious, strategic response to the rise of China? Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm mired in realism. We were talking about Amitabh Acharya down the road in Washington. If I were Amitabh, I might take a different tack, but I'm not, for better or worse. So I would argue that collective strategic autonomy in Southeast Asia is the road not taken. For all kinds of reasons, including the extraordinary weakness of ASEAN, its inability to generate collective strategic autonomy. And it simply means that, imagine that I'm representing the People's Republic of China, and you are each representing an ASEAN country. You outnumber me. I may be a hell of a lot bigger than you. And even if you all gang up together and pool your weaponry, I may still be ahead. But just psychologically, sitting at the table negotiating a COC, a Code of Conduct on the South China Sea, I'm in a different situation than I would be if I were just facing one of you at a time, where I could essentially, the old phrase, divida et impera, right? Divide and rule, pick you off, which is essentially what China has successfully done. In some cases, to varying degrees, I emphasize. The most obvious, the kind of iconic case of Cambodia, which has acquired, thanks to its arrangement with China, effectively a proxy veto inside ASEAN, so that China is guaranteed that ASEAN will not pass a resolution that will be, unseemly in Beijing's eyes, that will be critical of China, simply because it can be vetoed by Cambodia under the rule, the so-called ASEAN way of unanimity certainly on controversial questions that involve security and strategy, okay? Now I want to shift in the very short time that I have remaining, I'm not going to have time to do all this, to look at 4 countries, and I think I'm going to probably have to drop at least the last one, maybe the last 2. And for this purpose, I want to revert back to the kind of meandering number of ways that one can gloss the concept of strategy by simply simplifying all that into a SWOT, an SWOT, which I think is actually more operationally helpful than some of the more philosophical comments that I made at the beginning. SWOT. To be strategic, you need to first determine your own internal domestic strengths and weaknesses. Your capacity matters tremendously to the success of your strategy, both your strengths but also your weaknesses. And then to causally relate those strengths and weaknesses to the external O and T, the opportunities and threats that you face. Opportunities you want to take advantage of, external threats that you want to deflect. So you start with introspection, then you engage in calculation, and then finally you engage in proaction. That's the kind of simplified process here. Now, next is the utterly unanswerable question. I didn't think that it was unanswerable when I started trying to learn a little bit about strategy. I think it is unanswerable, at least by my remaining gray cells. And that is, which countries in Southeast Asia are the most strategic and which are the least strategic? It sort of lends itself, you have a listing, 11, countries here, and who's at the top and who's at the bottom. I just can't deal with that. But what I can do is back off from a systematic, truly scholarly, empirically based, blah, 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 reasonably responsible statement in this regard, and rank ordering, to suggest that in my experience and by my limited research, the good news is that a lot of other people who work on Southeast Asia share this view. So that's the good news. I have company. I may be wrong, but I have company. That the 2 most strategic countries in Southeast Asia are Singapore on the one hand and Vietnam on the other. And we can talk about the rationale behind that. So Singapore has the apparatus of strategy. There are 13 different departments in the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. 13 different departments. They are the only country in Southeast Asia, to my limited knowledge, that actually has a unit in that ministry devoted entirely to futurology. I mean, in a serious way, predicting the future. Not just in Southeast Asia, but globally. For example, working on the fascinating question as to whether or not Southeast Asia will be among the worst hit by global warming of all the regions in the world. I think the answer is probably nearly yes. And a lot of research really interesting research is being done on that inside the Singapore government. There's a side here that a road that I won't go down, which is to speculate, why are some countries, if you accept my language here, more strategic than others? And one answer would be, certainly in the case of Singapore, because they're small. Israel, I could go through the explanation of why Israel is extremely strategic, right? It's in a way the Singapore of the Middle East. Look at its environment, right? Both demographically, religiously, and so forth, right? Kosovo has an Office of Strategic Planning as well. I mean, I could go on, all right? So, now, Singapore. What to say? I would argue that in this la-la strategy, right, of trying to operate within the space that is created by the polarity now of China and the United States, there is a delicate dance to be done, right? This is often called hedging. The literature on hedging in Southeast Asia is massive and very creative. I don't know, there are dozens of different kinds of hedging. Kwek Cheng Hui, some of you may know him in Malaysia, has written a lot of really good stuff on this. The trick is to somehow strike a position which is not simply in the middle, equidistant from the two poles. I remember in fact, it is still, as many of you probably know, a kind of guiding motto in Indonesia to row between two reefs. Now, that comes from the immediate post-World War II period when the Cold War was just getting under the way, and the two Easts were, the West and the East, right? Communist China and Soviet Union on the one hand, and the United States on the other. But I would argue that that's rather like the grass and the elephants, because it is a complete sort of relinquishing of one's own autonomy. Because if you have to be equidistant from both reefs, if one reef moves, you are obliged to move in that direction to keep your middle status, right? This is geometry at an insane level. It makes no sense in terms of actual practical policy and behavior. So the skill of Singapore is that they are able, and I think this is an express strategy, to tilt gently in various ways in one direction and tilt gently in the other direction, so that they're never really clearly operating. If, for example, the Americans thought that the Singaporeans were glued to the middle, they would be annoyed. So would the Chinese, because it would remove the possibility of their gravitating toward the pole, which would be the desire, presumably, of both Beijing on the one hand, and I've just come from Washington, is certainly the desire of Washington on the other. And I'll give you an anthropological example here, stretching the term anthropology. I've just come from a meeting at the State Department where I was fascinated to learn this is going to be recorded, so I have to be a little careful. Fascinated to learn that there were, I think this is okay, that there were two different interpretations of what the Prime Minister of Singapore said at the Shangri-La Dialogue this year. One was that he was basically going back to the elephants. He did mention the elephants in his talk. We can get into this in the Q&A. And putting the United States here, and rather, because we have the United States has a close security relationship with Singapore, absolutely. On the security realm, very, very close indeed, as I'm sure many of you know. Although not widely publicized for obvious reasons, that Singapore does not want to be thought of, especially in Beijing, as being a handmaiden somehow of the United States. So one view was tremendous disappointment. My view is the opposite, because I was absolutely delighted and stunned as an academic who is interested in discourse and fascinated by discourse to see what Prime Minister Lee did. In his speech, and I wish I could read the quotes. I have a lot of quotes from the speech. I don't have time to read them, but I'll just share with you my conclusion. He starts with the elephants. Yes, he does. Okay, so that's kind of like a legitimating beginning, right? But he goes on from that, however, without naming China once, to talk about soft power in a kind of almost nostalgic way, as if to remember all the Americans that have come through Singapore, some of them rather bumbling, but rather empathic. And unlike the Chinese, who come and they have rhetoric, win-win. Did we tell you about win-win? Win-win is really important, right? But then they're behaving in the South China Sea. That's not exactly smile diplomacy. It's at least frown diplomacy, especially if I could recount for you the incidents in the South China Sea just in this year that show how brutal China can be. Ramming a boat, sinking, the 22 sailors fall into the ocean, right? They might have drowned And the Chinese boat that did it left without even trying to rescue them. If the Vietnamese hadn't been there, these Filipino sailors probably might all be dead. Who knows, right? I mean, really, the brutality is something, at least at that level. The United States, of course, is engaged in tremendous brutality, especially in Vietnam, which I'll get to in a moment. When I spoke in Washington, I said, look, I mean, you should applaud, because what he is sending the message to China is behave more like the Americans. We need more soft power. Where is your soft power? Don't think of your soft power as strictly money. In fact, there's a whole debate in the literature on soft power as to whether economic appeal is necessarily a part of soft power. How soft should power actually be under that definition, okay? And so if we look at the history of Singapore, all the way back to the days when the motto in Singapore was, we are a poisoned shrimp, a poisonous, shrimp. You eat us, yeah, you can eat us, one bite, you will die, because we will die inside you, causing you to die. We'll both die, right? It's suicide. You want suicide? Come on. I mean, the bravery, if I may use that term, okay, I take that back, actually. The boldness with which the founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, was able to project the notion of that is strategic autonomy right there. And my experience in Singapore is that no country in Southeast Asia, with the exception of Vietnam, has a clearer, stronger sort of commitment to the idea of strategic autonomy. All right, now Vietnam, and then I'll end, because I won't have time to get to the other two countries. I'll mention them, but I won't talk about them in detail. Okay, Vietnam's leaders know what their strengths and weaknesses are. As I said earlier, obviously one of their, maybe it's not an internal weakness, it's an external fact that they neighbor China. And of course, we all remember 1979 when China actually crossed the border, the northern border. I think they wish they hadn't, because I think they expected to deliver a blow that actually in many respects was delivered in the other direction by Vietnamese resistance. No country in Southeast Asia, including Singapore. Singapore is very artificial compared to Vietnam. No country in Southeast Asia has a more deeply rooted, historically validated on the battlefield, right, sense of its own national identity. I could tell you a wonderful anecdote about that based on my time in Hanoi. I will not do so. And in the case of Vietnam, I'll just skip over the argument and simply note that next year, as I'm sure you realize, Vietnam will chair ASEAN. So let me revert back to the inability of ASEAN to follow the three musketeers, right? One for all for one, facing China as a group. Now, I'm not suggesting Vietnam is going to succeed in somehow revamping ASEAN into a strategic actor. ASEAN is not a strategic actor. It is not. It's incapable of being a strategic actor in any sort of, volitional sense because of the diversity of Southeast Asia, the disagreements among the countries, and Vietnam is not going to be able to override that. But let's remember that Vietnam will set the agenda. Just as Thailand this year was able to set the agenda. I attended a meeting in Bangkok. Maybe I shouldn't say this. Anyway, I attended a meeting in Bangkok. I mean, I was amazed that the Thais actually invited idiots like myself to come to Bangkok and try to advise them on what they should do as chair of ASEAN. I mean, this was amazing. Talk about humble. I was shocked that they would do that. But it was interesting at the meeting that it became clear that what Thailand really wanted to do, and we were, I think, kind of intellectual decoration, if I may be perhaps a little bit unfair. I mean, I enjoyed the meeting tremendously, and we had a great reception, but I think what they really wanted to do was more of the same. I think some Southeast Asian countries, when they chair ASEAN, they just want to get through the experience, without screwing up somehow. And that appeared to be the case in Thailand. Although, never mind the although. Okay. Lastly on Vietnam, one thing. I said that an explicit statement of strategy is easier to identify as strategic for an external person like me who doesn't even read Vietnamese than it would be if it were otherwise. And fortunately for my argument, the three no's that undergird Vietnamese foreign policy, namely no military alliances, no aligning with one country against another, and no foreign military bases on Vietnamese soil, this is public knowledge. This is like, emblazoned on the foreign ministry ceiling for everybody to see. And I think what that does, in a fascinating way, is that it allows Vietnam to depart from each of those principles in subtle and calibrated ways that is hard for others to really say, well, no, they really do have a military alliance with X, with Russia, for example. Russia supplies Kilo submarines, as we know, to Vietnam, and they have close relations. And the Vietnamese, I might say so, the Vietnamese use their relationship with Russia brilliantly. For example, just one concrete example, when the Chinese come in, Repsol, the Spanish firm, is doing exploration in the South China Sea, inside the exclusive economic zone of Vietnam. And therefore, under international law, what China did was a violation of international law, especially, well, anyway, if you go in that direction, which I'm not going to do. Repsol gave up. I mean, hey, we're not going to trouble with China. We're in Europe, so boom, they left. China won. But the Vietnamese next invited Rosneft. Now, Rosneft is Russian. So did the Chinese come in and say, oh, get out? No, they didn't, right? The illustration of calibration in Hanoi is fascinating, and I'll skip this part, except I want to mention it. Strategic, comprehensive, cooperative, the adjectives that have been put in front of the word partnership. We live in a post-alliance period in some ways, looking at the Cold War. But alliances have been replaced by partnerships. And it's really fun and fascinating to look at this. Vietnam has very carefully calibrated those partnerships adjectively, so that, for example, the United States is not a strategic partner of Vietnam. Now, in some respects, it is. When the USS Vinson shows up, this aircraft carrier, right, and there's very close relations between. I'll be in Vietnam in December, between Vietnam and the United States, but Vietnam knows that if they made the United States a strategic partner, that would not be taken lightly in China. And China, on the other hand, has more adjectives than any other partner of Vietnam. There are a whole bunch of them. I could go through the list, but I won't. All right, so that's an example of calibrated strategy, which gets us away from the kind of false dichotomy of the two elephants and the grass. Okay, I'm going to make an assertion without backing it up that Indonesia does not have a strategy. It is not a strategic country. It is not a strategic country. This is amazing because it's the largest country, and remember going back to SWOT, right? What are your strengths? Well, my strength is I'm the biggest country in Southeast Asia. Not only that, the other members of ASEAN expect me to lead. Hey, so I've got an audience. No. Jokowi was a furniture salesman in Solo. He worried that the furniture's big, you can't just put it on a bicycle, that it wasn't getting rapidly enough from point X to point Y inside the archipelago, right? And so the Poros Maritime Dunia, the so-called, it's variously translated, I like to use the word nexus, as others disagree, global maritime nexus, which I always thought when I first heard the phrase meant, great, Indonesia finally is going to strategically take advantage of its position as the turnstiles between two oceans. Wow, what a better place to be. That's what Singapore does. They've done it for years, right, as the trading center. No, why don't they? No. I went to Washington, D.C., and I asked the ambassador, I said, this is great news. This means a whole new... He said, no, Professor Emerson, no, what have you been smoking? He didn't say that. He said, no, you're completely wrong. This has nothing to do with foreign policy. It's all about domestic infrastructure. Infrastructure, that's all it is. Build, right? That's the motto.
Fishing.
So, yeah, exactly. Fishing. Right. Okay. And fishing. Yes, that's right. And we could talk about Natuna during the Q&A. All right. Then the last thing is the Philippines. Well, I'm confused about the Philippines. There has been a change in strategy. Yes, I think you could talk about it that way. A pretty significant change, right? Because coincidentally, the 12th of July 2016, when the arbitral court made its decision, which was a tremendous yes to Aquino, the president of Singapore, just at the same time, Philippines, just at the same time, we have Duterte taking over as the president and refusing to take yes for an answer from the court. So there are two things about this. Did Aquino have a strategy? Yes. Did it work? Not very well. Not at all. Now, it could come up again. Duterte has not abandoned the arbitral court ruling, and he, in fact, gives some evidence that, at least in the conversations he recently had in Beijing, he goes there frequently, like maybe 4 or 5 times a year. He might sort of have it in his back pocket, hoping that the Chinese see what's in his back pocket, right? But it is, for the moment, not being pursued in any kind of major way at all. In fact, has been abandoned, effectively almost abandoned by Duterte. So is Duterte now in charge of a new Philippine strategy? Well, now we get back to the strengths and weaknesses, right? One of the weaknesses may be, in a country that claims to have a strategy, is that not everyone is on board. So the positions that are taken by the security professionals, the ones that, like DOD type strategy actors in Manila, their views are different from Duterte's. They're not the same. And I don't know, I'm not suggesting that there's some kind of a secret civil conflict going on inside the Philippine government. No, it's quite overt, actually. Lorenzana, the Secretary of Defense, if you read what he said at the Shangri-La Dialogue, it's not exactly as friendly towards China as one might expect if you're taking the Duterte position. And this leads me to a final comment, and I promise I will now shut up. If we think about strategy, especially grand strategy, we are almost naturally driven towards structural terminology. The elephants are a structure. They are a polarity, right? But it seems to me at this point in the 21st century, if I'm not, adding up too many events to think that there's some kind of wave going on, illiberalism is on the march. Populism is on the march. And so the old debate, I remember even the great man theory of history, which we all poo-pooed in graduate school as being, it was all about structure in graduate school, hegemony and words like that, right? No, it seems to me we are in a time, both with, a whole bunch of people, right? We could talk about Trump. We could talk about Xi Jinping, although I don't know enough to be sure of that. That agency is making its comeback in relation to strategy. And the agency of Duterte is raising serious questions about what a strategy is. If it's associated with basically one person, and we could talk about his biography, his psychology, his physical health, is he the Trump of the Philippines? Well, I don't really know, but I wouldn't reject it. Then we have to reconceive strategy in personal terms. And that tends to seem to me to undercut. If strategy has to do with consistency, agency in this case is very inconsistent. The policies both of Duterte, certainly of Donald Trump, are hard to fit under the rubric of strategy. So I end with my puzzlement, and I'll leave it at that. And thank you for listening. And thank you for being here.
All right. Thank you, John.